Hey guys, Jobin here. Time to do a review of the Boker Pocket Bowie. That's this knife here in the middle. Now, before I get to the review of the knife itself, there's some sort of, I guess you could call it meta information about my acquisition of this knife. I got it from bladeplay.com, and when I opened the box, there was no sheath or neck chain, which it's supposed to come with. So I contacted that company, and they said, well, we're actually out of stock of that knife, so we can't send you a replacement because we don't have it. We'll do a return or a refund, or you could contact Boker USA and see if they'll send you a new sheath. That was perfectly reasonable under the circumstances. They did the best they could for me. So I said, okay, I'll contact Boker, and I did. And for a large company, Boker got back to me pretty promptly. And no hassle, no questions asked. They just said, sorry about that, we'll send you a sheath. And they did. Now, issue number 2 was the sheath itself. And here, I think I'm going to cut some old footage I shot showing you what was the basic problem with the sheath. It's okay, there's a full mat down there. But basically all I did is I held the neck chain about 8 inches. Probably could have done it with less. Just let the knife drop. And it popped straight out. You know, that doesn't happen with the Azula, even if you let it drop a lot farther. Like about 16 inches. Still in there. So, as you saw, the factory sheath had serious retention problems. Now, I'm perfectly willing to accept the fact that this was a lemon. You know, stuff gets through. I would say particularly as this wasn't wasn't sheath that shipped with the knife. I don't know if maybe they have a quality control step where, you know, they double check by actually inserting the knife into the sheath. But whatever the case, it didn't work very well. And this is actually it here. After my attempts to reform it to get a tighter fit. And those basically failed. It's actually, as I thought about it, quite a tricky knife to sheath with kydex for upside down carry, particularly when they were trying to get the sheath profile this small. I mean, the way it is, the edges of the blade are barely away from the rivets. There's just very little leeway to work with. There's very little material back here to wrap around any part of the blade. And the knife design itself is one that's a little bit difficult, I think, for to set up an inverted neck carry sheath for. That's because it's a fairly straight design. There aren't a lot of protrusions to hook anything around. I mean, if you compare the finger guard here to the one on the Azula, you'll see there's a very large difference. And the handles are quite straight and a lot wider than the blade. So mechanically, there just isn't much to wrap a sheath around. And also, for its size, this is quite a heavy knife. It's not heavy in absolute terms, but it's about 3 ounces. And it feels heavy in hand, and a lot of that weight is in the handle. So you have a fair amount of mass basically hanging on a tiny bit of kydex wrapped around that little nub there. And that's kind of it. The Azula, by the way, with scales, both of these with lanyards. The Azula, as it is here, is 2.85 ounces, I believe. And this one is just over 3. So, after failing to fix the factory kydex sheath, And after the experience I had with Boker's customer service, I probably could have contacted them again and said, hey, this one isn't working, maybe I got a lemon. They probably would have sent me a new one. But at that point, I just felt like dealing with it myself. So I eventually got around to making my own kydex for this knife. And I have to say, this works quite well. I haven't done very many sheaths, but this is probably my best one. There's no rattle. It's not quite a perfect click, but you can definitely feel as it slides home, and it has adequate tension. Need to clean up a few of the edges here, but it's good, functional, and so once I had this, I started carrying the knife, using it, and testing it. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the quality and properties of the knife itself, and then we'll get into comparing it to two other knives in its class, which is why I have them here, the SE Azula and the CRKT Minimalist. The Boker is, in my opinion, a very attractive knife. It has this clip point blade, micarta handles with a large pin and a very nice oversized lanyard hole. In my opinion, having a lanyard hole on a small knife like this is quite important, particularly for a neck knife, as often this is essentially a three-fingered knife. So your pinky will be off the handle, and I like having something to wrap that finger around. Or if you flub the draw a little bit, you can catch it with your other fingers. So I think that's a very good feature to have. The blade steel is 440C, and I was actually quite impressed with its performance. 440C is not a stylish steel anymore, but its performance is quite good. And on a $30 approximately knife, I believe it is quite appropriate. In cutting tests I've done, it outperformed HCR13 MOV and Spyderco's VG10 in edge retention. If you're curious about, oh, knocked the camera around. If you're curious about my methodology, these are pretty informal tests, but basically I have uniform sheets of cardboard from the same type of stuff, and I go through, and I start with a shaving sharp blade, and I cut half a sheet or a sheet and check the edge. And HCR and VG10 most of the time have completely lost their ability to shave towards the end of the fourth sheet. The Pocket Bowie was still shaving somewhat up until somewhere in the first third of the fifth sheet. And it completely lost its ability to shave by the end of the fifth sheet. And this is where the edge stands now after doing that work. It will still slice paper moderately well. It has a tendency to sometimes tear, but it's actually doing quite good now. There's a few definite rough spots on the edge where the majority of the work is done. See, there's a tear there. If you're not very careful with your technique, it tends to... It doesn't... It has trouble biting sometimes. So as you see there, where it cut decently a few times, but it's kind of rough and not pretty, and you have to be very careful to start the cut exactly right, otherwise it'll just tear the paper. It will certainly no longer shave at this point, though it is still a functional edge. It'll do things like cut paracord with relatively little effort. So overall, I believe the steel is quite good for the price point, and it appears to have been heat treated quite well. So overall, we have a attractive knife with good materials and decent fit and finish at a fairly attractive price. However, it is as a working knife that some of my small complaints about the design start to come into play. Some of these are problems which are almost unavoidable in a knife this size. The small amount of working edge, for example. A short knife has inherent limitations. And more to the point, a knife designed to be held by 3 fingers has certain limitations. When you're doing a lot of cutting with it, particularly fairly heavy cutting, 3-finger knives have a tendency to sort of lever in your hand, and it can become uncomfortable. What I mean by that is you'll be holding them something like, well, let's go for the saber grip here. And you're cutting down into something, and the force is going up like that, so the blade gets pulled, and you get a lot of pressure on your thumb, and there isn't a lot of contact between the handle and your palm or fingers, and so it sort of rotates, kind of like that, and ends up pushing down quite hard on your ring finger. This is not a problem unique to this knife. Like I said, 3-finger knife designs tend to suffer from this if you're going to actually use them heavily. Which is one respect where I think the Foltz Minimalist actually shines quite well, because you hardly lose any cutting surface with this design. It's much, much lighter, and these deep finger recesses and these projections here actually serve to spread the torque across your index, middle, and ring fingers more evenly. And while it might appear, setting them side to side like this, that the handle on the Boker Pocket Bowie is approximately the same length as the Azula handle. And it is, functionally you have less handle length. And the Azula handle is right on the borderline for most people with average hands being able to get a comfortable 4-finger grip on it. So you have a knife which is, in the Azula, you have a knife which is barely larger, but has a bit more cutting edge and a more comfortable handle for doing actual work with. At least in my opinion, of course. Also, when cutting with the Boker Pocket Bowie, I found that this very deep ricasso here, with this sharp corner, occasionally snagged on things when attempting to start a cut. Because of course, working with a very short blade like this, you want to take care to start as far back as you can, otherwise the work's just going to slide off the tip before you cut all the way through it. So paracord isn't a terribly good example, but you could start back like that and end up with it caught. Whereas if you just casually start a lot further on, so you just slid through the paracord just fine, but cutting, say, thicker rope, and you start there, just to be able to do it quickly without very carefully positioning it, you could run out of blade. Let's put it that way. These aren't necessarily huge concerns. If the knife seems attractive to you, by all means, you certainly get one. It's well made, good steel, and not that expensive. It is a knife I would recommend to somebody looking for a stylish little EDC fixed blade, and something I would feel particularly comfortable recommending to people with fairly small hands. If you're looking for a working knife and you have medium or large hands, I would strongly suggest the Azula. If you want a very short bladed EDC fixed blade and you want something very, very light that is still capable of doing work, this is actually a pretty good choice, and is also a very, very inexpensive knife. overall, the Boker Pocket Bowie, while it's a very competent design, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of fans, doesn't quite tickle my fancy. I find myself happier with my Azula, but that's not to say this is a bad knife at all. So, there you go, guys. That's my review. Boker Pocket Bowie. Hope you enjoyed it. This is Jobin signing off, saying, remember where your knife is.